can everybody hear me now? Before I continue. Can you hear me?
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I was saying that women also should not be protecting perpetrators. And it's usually in order to keep up appearances. Like, to what extent do we let go of appearances? And I was bringing up the example of, in families, there's usually that uncle that is like an unsaid rule that the children mustn't go and play with that uncle because he's more likely than not very inappropriate with children, but he still goes to family functions. He's still allowed to be around children, even though he's highly inappropriate with children, but he's still being protected by women in the family. Yeah, that was my main point.
Okay.
Cool. Interesting there, and thanks for your insights, ladies. I think that really does, from a male point of view, really does give into context the way you view things. And similarly to my co-facilitator, I'd like to direct this to the men, and again, in staying with the notion of solutions-based. I don't know how many of the gentlemen on the panel are from all boys schools, but we know the culture and the traditions, the staunch traditions of the boys school environment. And again, I speak from a personal point of view in having gone to a very staunch boys school, that a lot of that culture within the boys school, from the skim sum to the Bootmanskap to the all for one, one for all, a lot of underlying tones of a lot of what the lady spoke about in terms of patriarchy, in terms of males being right, in terms of boisterousness, in terms of a man must be a certain type of man. We might go from the haircut to a gentleman must wear a belt and the shoes must look like this, to uniformity. So I want to ask the gentleman, in that culture, particularly the staunch boys' school culture that we have in South Africa, how can we use that environment and knowing what we know in addressing gender-based violence? And not to say that it happens in the schools and where they are, but I guess what I'm trying to say is the culture emanates from that toxic, I guess you could say, environment. So how do we begin to deconstruct the toxic male environment in staunch boys' schools in the efforts to address gender-based violence? I will start with Tafara there. We haven't heard you in quite a while, so I'll start with you, sir.
Yeah, sorry about that. There was a bit of a noise in the background, so I was muted accordingly. But essentially, really, what my thoughts are surrounding this issue, and I do say this with a certain level of experience, as you mentioned, Lux, just going to a very staunch boys' school. Look, I'm going to put it bluntly, right? I'm going to be extremely honest here when I say that young boys are extremely susceptible. Young boys are extremely impressionable. And unfortunately, what you find is a culture of perpetuation, something that repeats itself to the point where you can't eradicate the problem, right? I'll give you one example. When I was in grade 8, we had matric boys who would call us to come and sit with them, right? They didn't care what we had to say. It was more so that we could come and listen to their conversation and feel like, gents, look at me, I'm now with the big boys, if you put that in inverted commas there. And what they were talking about, right? And I'll never forget this day. I sat there quietly just listening to what it is that they had to say. And one guy was talking about how VAC was coming around the corner and you had to be going somewhere for December. You had to go for a jaunt in December. Break up with your girlfriend before you leave. That's what he said. Break up with your girlfriend before you go to VAC, because you need to be having a new girl every single day for the time that you're away. Then maybe if you come back, you can get with your girl again and don't tell her. So that's what he said. Okay. And now I'm going to use that to launch what I'm trying to say here. Unfortunately, what you find is that the voices of the older boys in these staunch boys' schools contribute towards the culture of toxicity. It's not necessarily the fact that young boys come from homes that teach toxicity. It's the fact that they come from homes and go into an environment that perpetuates it. And I think maybe from a solutions-based thing now, for me, I'm very big on education, right? I strongly believe that changing the mindset changes the community, and finding ways in which one could then, speak about the harm, right? The harm of the level of language used and what that does. So for example, that test raped me, or for this week, I'm going to be bending over backwards for this test period, or whatever the case might be. Teaching boys that language, for starters, is very wrong. It's very oppressive in its very nature. And maybe just to kind of end off there with what I'm trying to say is, I only found out that the word or the phrase bending over for this test week period was problematic when I was in grade 11. I was 17 years old when I found out that was oppressive in its very nature. And that was only because someone educated me on it. And so I strongly believe that in order to not be a society, or rather a school culture that addresses issues of rape or sexual assault as they come, we need to become a school society that addresses issues at the root, which is talking to the mindset, talking to the way that people engage with these issues, the language that's used, the topics that are discussed with friends.
So, Tafara, you raise very good topics, and I'm going to bring Given in here very quickly on the same point. And I say to Given, in the same question, how important are senior female role models in staunch boys' schools in addressing exactly what Tafara said? Because I think, you know, in our experience in these boys' schools, not very often would you see a female in a position of power and authority. So, you know, Tafara spoke about the culture, the wording that's used, you know, the traditions, but they come from somewhere. They come from a decision-making body. They come from senior management. They come, you know, and a lot of that, in a lot of the schools, there are no females there. So given what role or how important it is to have females in the system, but not only have females in the system, but in positions of power and authority and decision-making bodies?
I think firstly, Lux, at Sonke, we call, instead of females, we say women. I think the role of senior women, right? But I think, just quickly, I think the first point, the common denominator here is toxic masculinity. So my response is, it may seem trivial, but the thing is, you don't have to be toxic to be masculine. And that's the problem, right? Masculinity is a social construct. You know, simply defined, you can call it, you can say attributes that are given to men and boys that are not biological. Therefore, even women, in some instances, can and are allowed to exhibit masculine characteristics. So there's nothing wrong about, with being masculine, but we need to teach our boys that masculinity doesn't necessarily have to be toxic. And masculinity is toxic as soon as it is violent, as soon as it is unemotional, as soon as it is sexually aggressive. But you can keep your masculinity, just don't exhibit, any toxic traits. That's the thing, because a lot of boys feel that now their manhood is questioned if you're questioning their masculinity. There's nothing wrong with be masculine if you want, but just don't be toxic at it. That's it. And I think the second question on the role of women, it's important. And I think it speaks now to what Nobu said earlier, because we need to be careful of burdening women of the responsibility of fighting the scourge, right? Women do not kill themselves. They do not kill themselves. So we must be wary of then putting back the responsibility, or the responsibility back to a senior woman that is, that is exposed to the boys. But what I can say is that, just back to the topic of education that we spoke about earlier, is that women as perhaps social educators, yes, they have a role. Women as, women speaking out in injustices, yes. But I think we need not then put the pressure back onto women to try and change this mindset. This is a patriarchal problem that men benefit from, and it is men who have to carry the burden of dismantling that mentality.
100%. Thanks for those insights given, and for correcting me a little bit earlier. Mpilo, I'm going to put you on the spot here, and I apologize. There's a question from Luke, and I think it adds in to exactly what we're trying to answer here. You know, we look at gender-based violence in a certain manner, and we look at the role of the toxic male school environment towards females in particular. But where Luke is coming in and saying, and it leads to what Given was saying about, you know, my masculinity and what that means. What happens when a boy assaults another boy sexually? What happens when the roles change, as we've seen in one of the top schools in the country, where it was a female that was alleged to have sexual relations with a boy? So we talk about toxic masculinity, we talk about patriarchy, but very quickly, Mpilo, and jumping to the point, what happens when those roles are reversed? How do we as role models, particularly males, in these male institutions, how do we address gender-based violence from that point of view? Are you with us, Mpilo?
Oh, yes, I can hear you now. It just cut for a moment, sorry. But to answer the question that you've asked, and I've been reading, I actually was going to get to Luke's point. We have to first of all address the long-standing tradition in these all-boys schools of not a Saint Mang boy. He doesn't do this. This boy could never do this. He belongs to this school and this school, you know. It could never be this boy. You know, we don't do that. That's simply not what I do. And simply like Given was saying, you know, it's not women killing themselves. You know, this is done by boys, and first that we need to, by men and boys, we need to first understand that men and boys can be victims and are perpetrators. It's not some ghost doing it. So with regards to the question here, in these all boys schools, there's a sort of notion that my boy who goes to JP or whatever school can never do these things, you know, can never go through these things. But we need to understand that this is a systemic issue that anyone at any time, at any place can go through, that we need to stop idealizing, you know, the particular issue at hand. Because, for example, the same way how the same way we view GBV and how we handle it negatively impacted the boy who was abused, that's how it negatively impacts the girl who was abused. Because he was abused and he probably told someone and they were like, oh, dude, you're so lucky. You know, she's probably like really pretty. And, you know, sorry to be vulgar, but that's at the root what happens at these boys' schools. Similarly, when a woman comes and says, you know, so-and-so did this to me, it's like, oh, no, he could never. Absolutely not. You know, he's upstanding. And we need to understand that one person's angel, you know, can be another person's devil. We don't know those people 24/7. We don't live in and out their lives. So we need to, at first, when we hear something, is not to be protective of it, you know, and especially at these schools where they have a very protective culture in terms of handling these issues. It's, oh, no, just please keep quiet. You know, this could ruin the reputation of the school, as if the reputation of the school is worth more than lives. You know, as if the reputation of this person or this friend group is worth more than the dignity and respect and lives of the people that it impacts. You know, and I think that is what we need to address at these schools, by first seeing everyone in the school as a human being, as a man, and holding them all accountable for it, and also engaging them and allowing them to come forward, you know, and say, you know, this has been happening, you know, and not glorify, you know, the type of abuse that we see glorified, you know, when a woman abuses a man.
Yeah,
Sorry,
thanks for that.
Lux.
Thanks for that, Mpilo.
And
I hope Luke was able to get some sort of answer there. I'm going to shoot straight to my co-facilitator for the next question.
Sorry, can I just, Seva, Ria?
Yes, love. Yeah.
I think that, like, with boys' schools, there's one issue that always gets put to the sidelines. I think that Black boys, particularly in boys' schools, there's the issue of the toxic masculinity. Then there's another layer of that, of the racism. And I just want like an understanding of where the violence towards Black women a lot of the time comes from, and how does that manifest in your spaces? Because as someone who went to a private school and was treated terribly by my fellow Black boys, how do you think that kind of culture of treating Black women terribly can be changed in private schools or boys' schools in this context?
Is it all right if I take that question?
Sure.
All right, perfect. So, to my understanding, and this is obviously, there's a lot of work that's being done in this space currently, and so there's still a lot more that can be said that I might not touch on, but there's a prevalent issue of internalized racism. Okay. My Zulu teacher, Mashangen, and I'm going to take this time to give a huge shout out, because she was incredibly impactful in the way that I dealt with racism from other boys, but also just in and amongst my friend group of Black boys. Okay. When a young Black boy looks at himself in the mirror and he doesn't see the straight nose, the long hair, the pronounced chin, the straight teeth, the beard that's normally associated with white boys, he hates himself, right? And unfortunately, that hate then translates onto women. And that's just the truth of the matter. A lot of my Black female friends who went to the girls' school across the field, literally across the field from my school, were victims of that self-hate. That's what it is. It's self-hate. Where to the point, young Black boys would look at a dark skinned Black girl, and in their eyes, she would be less prettier than a light-skinned Black girl. Not because of the way she speaks, not because of the way she thinks, not because of how she is around people, but purely because of the tone of her skin, right? And unfortunately, that hate has matured. I'll call it that. It's matured into something that has gone beyond hate, right? To the point where a Black boy could raise his hand against a Black woman and strike her purely because he sees hate within himself, because he's not like a white man, right? And that is just the truth of the matter. Someone says that a lot of people like to say that it's a white man's world, and I don't disagree. It is a white man's world, to the point where Black men feel powerful when they're in the seats of white men, and that is just the truth of the matter. And if they can't be in the seat of white men, it's because they're Black, and then that hate translates into violence against women, and that's just the research and some of the discussions that are being had around that. I don't know if that answers your question, Boyes.
It does. I just think I have another issue, is that I understand the self-hate, but as Black girls, we also go through the same thing. We also a minority in a largely white space. I mean, we have our afros. Our afros get called bird nests all the time. So the kind of self-hate, we also go through it. We just don't perpetuate that. I just feel like the whole lack of introspection and accountability in those spaces. I know on social media there's this trend to say you guys are brainwashed, and it's this kind of infantizing of Black men that happens, that strips them of accountability and to interrogate your guys' actions. You said something. You asked me something else?
No, I just wanted to know if it answered your question.
I was going to... Fine. It left in my head.
I like the trend that we're setting here, which is accountability and responsibility. And I wanted us to discuss, how do we actually feel about the conversation concerning the death penalty and introducing that in South Africa's legislation. I'm going to ask Slee to kind of jump in over here. Are you able to jump in?
Yeah. Yeah, no, let's jump in. So yeah, that's quite debatable because I think the death penalty, it's almost like, I mean, we used to have it, I think it was during apartheid where the death penalty was implemented and then they took it away. So that whole process of, I guess, us being now a liberating sort of country and wanting to be sort of equal and not wanting the death penalty, it's almost like trying to sort of build the nation to an extent, because I think when you look into the sort of trials post-apartheid and these kind of convictions, there wasn't necessarily the death penalty, but these particular white racists would be convicted by going to jail or whatever it may be. So I think it's going back now into this idea of the death penalty is something that we could possibly reconsider, in terms of, especially because, I mean, GBV it's hectic. The statistics are rising, femicide rates are rising. We're seeing a lot of women that are being killed. So the justification for the death penalty makes sense. It does make sense, but I think, is South Africa willing to kind of implement that? And if so, I guess, how would we go about doing so? Would it be in a certain case where every GBV case is considered to be worthy of death penalty to an extent, or you know what I mean? So I think there's kind of things that we have to look into. But yeah, I mean, it's very nitty gritty. Do we implement it? Do we not? Yeah.
I think like the death penalty, from what I've read, has proven to be ineffective in countries that do have the death penalty. The amount of people on death row, people can wait 20 years being on death row. There's shortage of the lethal injections that they use for the death penalty. So as much as you've put a person on death row, they're still alive. Like they wait years for the actual death to occur. So the death penalty itself, in terms of actually executing people, I don't know how effective it is in terms of doing its job. As a deterrent, I don't even think it's effective either. America has the death penalty, but their crime rate is still pretty high. So I don't think the death penalty does what it's supposed to do as a deterrent.
I think if I can jump in here, what we need, and I'm gonna say this, death penalty or not, for as long as people who commit GBV know that they are getting caught is, unlikely.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. We could have a death penalty and kill them 10 minutes later. For as long as they know that I can go to court, that's fine. They'll probably find me not guilty because they catch too few people. Let's leave the rest aside. Of the people who are arrested, they only end up convicting roughly 11%. What we do need is legislative change, I agree, but I think we need to change the way that we trial GBV. I promise you, if we move from, instead of innocent until proven guilty, if we move from guilty until proven innocent, you would see the rapid change in the behavior of people, because now the imminent fear of, if you get caught and you go to a court case, you are definitely going to get convicted. The change would be astronomical, I believe, because then no one could say, I'm not going to get arrested, because you're going to get convicted. And now you'd see men work so much harder at proving that they're not guilty. And you just see I believe you'd see like a more rapid change in the behavior of men. If in every single encounter, they know that this could be an encounter that sends me to jail, to prison. You'd see people, I promise you, I was laughing about it with my dad. He said, people would literally record consent for sex. They'd be like, do you want to have sex, and record it? And that's what we need. We need something that's going to shock people into acting correct, And I think that's one of the things that we can do, in terms of legislative change. Make it more likely that people will get caught, make it more likely that less people will slip through the cracks, because now way too many people are getting away with it, and also to remove defamation of character should not be applicable for GBV. I think that's, sorry?
No, sorry, finish.
My last thing is to say, like, defamation of character should not be applicable for GBV. because I think that strips away women's ability to speak up. You know, the fact that I was reading now on Twitter about Lerato Malloy, she's in prison now. You know, she got arrested for just speaking about the whole incident because perpetrators have the ability to say, well, we're not in court yet, so defamation of character, that needs to be stripped away, you know, and more power needs to be given to victims instead of perpetrators. Because as it stands now, perpetrators have 99% of the power.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's quite insightful. Thank you so much. I picked up on justice kind of coming in, and I think we can't talk about justice in this country if we do not talk about our South African police force. And in the past, we have had a police force that has responded to gender-based violence just by increasing force and not necessarily kind of fostering a trusting relationship between our communities and the police force. So I think my question to panelists, and I think I want to direct this one to Given, is how exactly should we use SAPS to be more effectively to fight GBV? And I think we can also look at how SAPS has treated foreigners and sex workers in regards to GBV and in cases where they have become involved as victims or perpetrators of gender-based violence.
I think I like the justice conversation. It's a very interesting conversation, a necessary conversation. And why? It's because it touches on a lot of the work that we do. I think just briefly and quickly on the issue of the death penalty and other, you know, for example, chemical castration, you know. I think Slee was the one who said they are, you know, you can see why people are calling for it. It's understandable. But for example, if I make an example of chemical castration, right? To simply remove a man's penis means nothing because rape, for example, is not about sex, right? Rape is not about sex. Rape is about violence. Rape is about power, you know? So you can remove a man's penis and then, you know, after that next week, he'll just, you know, butcher a woman because it's about power, it's about dominance, you know? So I think for me, measures such as, for example, the penalty for me are after the fact measures. So you've now murdered a woman, now therefore you're also going to get killed. But it does nothing to address the societal problem of men wanting to dominate women. You know, so I think that's just my touch on that, on those issues. But then to touch on what Mpilo said, but we do need a reconfiguration of the justice system as it is, because as it currently stands, it's not working. You can introduce the death penalty, for example, but who are you going to kill? Because you can't even find the perpetrators, you know? So in the first place, it would be almost useless because who are you going to kill in the first place? Because our justice system is failing to call the perpetrators to book, you know? So on the issue of the police, you know, we have, I mean, just as an organization that works with gender-based violence stats are always out on gender-based violence. Sometimes they're high, sometimes they're low, but I'd like to put on record that as Sonke, we seldom moved by the stats because South Africa is a country that has a high case of underreporting. And women do not report cases at a very high level because women do not have faith in the justice system and the police.
Yeah.
So the old question, I mean, it's a philosophical question. I think it was Plato who asked it, that who guards the guardians? In this instance, who guards the police? Who educates the police? And as it stands, our police are not fully equipped to understand the intricacies of gender-based violence. And so as long as that happens, and as long as that remains, women will continue to stigmatize police because police will continue reacting the way that they do. Now, I'm not, again, defending the police because they do not deserve any defending, but they exist in a society that is highly patriarchal and a society that needs transformation. And so as long as we don't see the police as protected from being educated, then we won't move. So the police need to be educated in gender-based violence. And again, just quickly on issues of solutions. This is why in Sonke, at Sonke, 2 months ago, we started training the police program. We started this in the Eastern Cape, where we had a 3-day workshop on access to justice, how police, so we had a workshop with police and women. And we had women addressing police, women telling police how they'd want to be addressed, how they'd want police to react to their issues. So for me, to go back to Lax's question earlier on education, let's not forget that our guardians are not protected from education. Heck, our president can learn a thing or two on gender-based violence, you know? So I think for me, the police as the first point of call for a lot of women need to be thoroughly educated. And as it stands, what they know and how they treat gender-based violence is insufficient, and we'll continue to have a lot of women not reporting cases of gender-based violence.
Yeah,
I think. Mine is just quick. I think that as a woman going to the police, that my trust for them is very low, because I know probably I'm going to speak to someone who has perpetuated these types of crime on their wives, on their sisters as well. So I think even it just being a distrust in the police is just a distrust in men, like to have the compassion to understand the trauma.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, given you were very correct in saying that the issue is the implementation process. And I think I realized when I was doing my research last year in human trafficking, and Ria Betwa, you spoke about sex workers. And how you find that a lot of reported cases about sex workers and the gender-based violence that are there are very small. And the reason being is because we have this sort of stereotype of sex workers being that they cannot be abused because, I mean, they're offering sex. So essentially things like rape and sexual abuse is something that is not common in the sex work community, but it is common. The issue is that they are unreported. There's a stereotype against them. And as you were saying, given with the whole, the police as well have a very misguided notion about sex workers. And they often, when they hear these reports, they either just completely dismiss themselves from it. They just dismiss the sex worker, and they will say, well, you got yourself into this issue. And this is where education plays a role. We need to educate the police force about this, because South Africa has a very good human trafficking policy in terms of its bill. We have very good policies in terms of gender-based violence and how we can step by step mitigate violence against women. However, implementation is where the issue comes in, because why? Patriarchy is embedded. Regardless of whether you're in the police force, you have this embedded patriarchal nature, and that's where behavioral changes needs to take place. Okay.